This is the new clutch set that's going to be going into the Dakota. It's a stage 1 off-road set that's made by Clutch Max. And the biggest difference between this and the OEM clutch, you have a little bit better material in the clutch disc, and the pressure plate, it has stronger springs on it so that it gives it a more positive engagement when it grips the clutch. It's going to make the clutch pedal a little bit stiffer, but it shouldn't be that noticeable. The other upside to this kit, it was actually about $20 cheaper than buying the OEM kit, and you're going to get a little bit of extra performance out of it. Now, out of this entire kit, the only thing that I'm not going to be using is the pilot bearing. Again, the clutch that was in this, it's only got like 10 to 15,000 miles on it. These little clutch bearings, they can be pretty tough to get out of there. So I'm just going to throw a little bit of extra grease on it and go from there. I could do the same thing with the throwout bearing, but it is so easy to put back in place. You know, you just undo a couple of clips and slide it on. I'll go ahead and just toss that in there. Okay, I've got the new clutch setup installed on the Flywheel. All 6 of the bolts, which are 9/16 head size, they've all been torqued down to 30 foot-pounds. Now we're on to should be the last part of the job that's going to be real tough. Getting this transmission lifted up into place and lined up with that pilot bearing and get it bolted onto the, back of the engine. Sometimes it takes a little bit of wiggling and back and forth, and sometimes it pops on real easy, and sometimes it's a real bear. Okay, it's time to put the starter back in. Okay, I've got the starter bolted in. Now I can put the clutch slave cylinder back on. And I'll go ahead and plug in this little plug here while I've got easy access to it. Okay, now let's get this transfer case shifter bolted back into place. Don't forget to reinstall your oil filter. And then let's get this transmission mount bolted back into place. Now we got to get this cross member back up into place, and as you probably remember from earlier on in the video, I had to press this out of place with the scissors jack because the frame was tweaked. So now I have it sitting on top of the transmission jack, and I'm going to use that to hopefully press it back up into place and get it in position without bending or tweaking anything anymore. I've got the cross brace bolted into place, and now the transfer case is up on the transmission jack and ready to go in. I put a thin bead of RVT silicone sealer just around this lip all the way around. It doesn't take very much. You really don't want to overdo it on the sealer. If you can see it on there, you've got more than enough. I mean, you really want this stuff to be paper thin. A lot of people think that with this sealer, you have to just goop it on and get all the cracks and everything filled in. But honestly, if you put too much on, it can create problems later. You go to bolt it down, it doesn't bolt down tight enough. The stuff eventually works out. It starts to leak. So in this situation, thinner is actually better. So I'm going to go ahead and lift this up with the jack and get it bolted in. Okay, I've got the transfer case bolted in now, and the next thing that I did was get these plugs hooked back up. So one there on the back, and the two that are up there on the top. Now the next thing to do is to reconnect this shift linkage for the transfer case. So I think my best bet here is to use a pair of vice grips. See if I can get a hold of this and just press it into place. Well, it'll work, but I'm going to need both hands. I've got the exhaust bolted back up to the manifolds, and this was kind of a tough job to do. Those are bolts and not studs that come off of the manifolds. And so you got to lift this thing up into place. You got to get that flange up in place, get the bolts down through it. And then you got to try and hold all of that together with one hand and keep that nut, keep the bolt from turning while you're threading the nut on. Almost need a second person for it, but I was able to eventually get it. And I think this is the worst part that's done now. All the rest of it should be pretty easy. While I was over here on this side, I went ahead and got this last wire plugged back in. This is the one that comes off of the exhaust manifold and goes up to the little plug that's right above the transmission. Okay, I have the front driveline bolted back in. When I bolted it on to the transfer case, the yoke end down here at the differential, it wasn't lining up. I had to put the transmission in neutral and the transfer case in neutral in order to get the driveline itself to turn. And once I was able to get that turned, I just lined it up, popped it in place, put the caps and bolts back on. And now I'm going to move on to getting these track bars for the suspension put back in. So I've got the skid plate and the traction bars all bolted back into place. On the transfer case, I put that hose back on the fitting that's on the top of the T-case. And then the next thing that I'm going to do, now that I actually have the driveline, I don't have it fully installed, but I have the rear section of the driveline put up into the transfer case so it's not going to leak any more fluid. So what I need to do now, crack open that top vent. You can see it right there pretty much in the middle of the screen. That takes a 10 millimeter Allen wrench. I'll pop that out of there. You always want to pop that out first before you drain out the bottom. The reason being, you don't want to drain all the fluid out and then find out that this, that your top fill hole, that the plug is stuck in it or cross-threaded. It's kind of hard to put the fluid back in if you only got the bottom hole to work with. So I'll pop that top one out, pop the bottom one out, drain everything out of it, put the bottom plug back in, and then just use the top vent hole to put the fluid back in until it starts to run out. And on this particular model, you do not put gear oil in the transfer case. It actually takes synthetic transmission fluid. If you put regular old gear oil in there, the gear oil is actually too thick, and when all the gears and everything in there get to turning, it'll suck all that up out of there, and it won't flow back fast enough, and the lower gears will end up actually getting run dry, and you're gonna cut the life of your transfer case at least by half, if not worse. So having that thinner transmission fluid in there, it allows it to pick it up and lubricate the gears, but it's still thin enough that it comes back down into the transfer case and make sure that the bottom gears are staying lubricated. So over here on the transmission, I'm not going to change the fluid out in it. Supposedly, these NV3500 transmissions, as long as they're not leaking, not having any problems, supposedly you don't ever have to change out the gear oil. I'm not sure if that's something I would really stick to myself. I mean, how are you going to know if there's anything going wrong with the transmission if you never pull that plug and never check see if you got filings coming down? So it's not going to hurt it if you feel the need to, you know, change out the fluid on these on a regular basis. On the other 5 speeds, they recommend changing the fluid out like every 30 to 40,000 miles. You know, maybe change it out every 100,000 miles in this. It doesn't cost that much, ain't gonna hurt it. But I'm not gonna change out the fluid on this. So all I'm gonna do is just crack open the top hole, and it uses this special wrench that is a 17 millimeter hex wrench. It's basically just a great big Allen wrench in the shape of a socket. Anyways, use that to undo that plug, and then I'll be putting some Synchromesh gear oil in it that's made by Valvoline, and I'm just going to squirt it in to make sure this thing's topped off. Just keep squirting it in there until it starts to run out the hole. Once it runs out the hole, then it's at the proper level and you're good to go. Put the plug back in. Okay, I'm finally down to the very last part of the job, and that's getting this drive line bolted back up to the rear differential. And the way that the four-wheel drive system works on this truck, once you have that front drive line bolted in, even if you put the transmission and the transfer case both in neutral, this rear drive line is not going to turn on its own to get it indexed into place. So what I've had to do, put a jack under the rear axle on this side, get the tire up in the air just enough that I can spin it. And by being able to spin that one tire, I can rotate it and make this joint index to the correct position. And so I'm going to go ahead and pull those the caps and the bolts off and get that thing bolted in. I don't know if you can hear it or not, but I can hear some ricer down there at the end of our road testing out the fart can on whatever Honda or Toyota or Subaru, whatever it is he's running down there. But he's really revving her up and showing off. So as you can see, I've got all the shifters, shift knobs, front and rear console all back into place. I've already taken the truck on a test drive. Just make sure that all the four-wheel drive and all the gears work, not making any funny noises, everything's shifting fine, clutch feels great. So this truck's good to go.